Okay, here we are. Wednesday's reading. Yesterday, of course, Caliban and Sycorax ate all of the cream puffs. Well, I don't know if they ate them all, but they certainly messed them all up, and now Holling has 10 more days to get them for the class. We also know that Holling is now part of the Long Island Shakespeare's Holiday Extravaganza. We don't know what that means yet, but we'll find that out pretty soon. And today we're going to finish November and head into December. Here we go. Usually, the last week before Thanksgiving was pretty easy. Everyone is thinking about 2 days off from school, grandparents coming for dinner, the Syosset-Farmingdale football rivalry, and all that. But it wasn't an easy week this year. Not for me. It was a long week. First, it somehow became my fault that Sycorax and Caliban ate the cream puffs. I think this was because of Marilee. For 3 days, things were whispered about me that I hope I never have to hear. Then second, on Wednesday afternoon, when I went to get the script for the Long Island Shakespeare Company's Holiday Extravaganza from Mr. Goldman, I found out that I was going to play Ariel from the Tempest. Ariel is a fairy. A fairy. Let me tell you, it is not a good thing for a boy from Camillo Junior High to play a fairy, especially a boy who has been singing soprano for Miss Violet of the Very Spiky Heels. So do you remember way back when he ripped on the clothing that Shakespeare folks wore? Connection. I don't think I can play Ariel, I told Mr. Goldman. Here's your costume, he said, and handed me a pair of bright yellow tights with white feathers on the... Well, I'll let you guess what part the white feathers were attached to. Third, now that I needed another set of cream puffs, I asked my father if I might ever imagine a 3-week advance on my allowance, since he had clinched the deal with the Baker and Sporting Emporium, and he just laughed out loud. You ought to be a comedian, he said. You and Bob Hope.
The Bob Hope Christmas
You could
Special.
travel to Saigon together and do some troop shows. I wasn't trying to be funny, I said. You must have been trying to be funny, since no kid of mine in his right mind would ever ask for a 3-week advance on his allowance, he said. I was trying to be funny, I said. I thought so, he said. Fourth, when I told Marilee that I might not be able to get the cream puffs by next Wednesday, I wouldn't spread that around if I were you, she said, and that my father was a cheapskate since he'd just landed this big deal with the Baker Sporting Emporium and he wouldn't give me a dime, she started to cry. Really? All right. So now's when you have to realize, like, why is she crying when he mentioned the fact that Hood and Associates got the job for the Baker Sporting Emporium. Do you remember who the other architect was trying to get that job? Kowalski and Associates? Holling's not, he doesn't even realize it or isn't thinking about it. So she starts to cry. And why is she crying? Because her dad didn't get the job. And of course that means that their family's struggling. Marilee, I said, it's not all that bad. I'll find a way to get the cream puffs. I mean, you jerk, said Marilee. You don't understand anything. And she wouldn't speak to me or anyone else the rest of the day. He is kind of a jerk there. Fifth, on the Tuesday before the Wednesday of the cream puffs deadline, Mr. Goreshi came in and asked Mrs. Baker if she knew what pied ninny meant. Who asked Holling about the word pied ninny? She asked him why he needed to know that, and he told her that Doug Switek's brother was in his office at that very moment for having called Mr. Ledema a pied ninny. Mrs. Baker stared straight at me. And sixth, when Wednesday morning came around and I walked in with a bag of 5 cream puffs, which was as far as a 1-week allowance stretches, it was pretty clear that I was doomed. With 5 cream puffs, almost everyone could have had 1/4 of a cream puff, I pointed out. It was better than nothing. Marilee shook her head. You're dead, said Danny Hupfer. And I suppose I was. At least I wouldn't have to wear yellow tights with the white feathers attached, you can guess where. But you know that stuff about the darkest nights turning into the brightest dawns? That can sometimes come true, even when you least expect it. Because when we came back in from recess, on the shelf was a long box from Goldman's Best Bakery, filled with 24 cream puffs. 24, chant, brown, light, perfect cream puffs. 24 buttery vanilla cream puffs. Mr. Hood was simply playing a joke on you all, said Mrs. Baker. Now enjoy. And we did. Where'd the cream puffs come from? Clearly it came from, I know you're all thinking it, Mrs. Baker. Mrs. Baker, who sort of cost Halling the other cream puffs. She probably felt bad, or maybe she was just being, a good teacher. It was my fault, so I'm going to make sure that he gets it. But I like the way that she did it. Now, does Mrs. Baker hate Halling? That afternoon, Mrs. Baker asked me if I thought that the ending to The Tempest was happy or not. Maybe because I had just had my own happy ending, I told her that I figured it was. How about for Caliban, she asked. Does he deserve a happy ending? No, he's the monster. If there's going to be a happy ending, it means he has to be defeated. You can't end Godzilla without killing Godzilla. And you can't end the Tempest without Caliban getting what, Mr. Hood? He can't win. No, he can't win. But sometimes I wonder if perhaps Shakespeare might have let something happen that would have at least have allowed a happy ending, even for a monster. Some way for him to grow beyond what Prospera thought of him. There is a part of us that can be so awful. And Shakespeare shows it to us in Caliban. But there's another part of us too, a part that uses defeat to grow. I wish we could have seen that by the end of the play. She closed her book. I love that even though Caliban is a monster and really bad in The Tempest, Mrs. Baker is the kind of person who wants to see that character not end up in a bad way. That shows you some character there from Mrs. Baker. Now, you could be thinking levels of her bringing in the 24 brown, light, perfect cream puffs, and then the level of a person who thinks that way about people, that she wishes Shakespeare would have let Caliban change into a better person. Defeat doesn't help you grow, I said. It's just defeat. Mrs. Baker smiled. 2 weeks ago, the Saturn V lunar rocket passed its first flight test. It's been less than 10 months since we lost 3 astronauts.
Almost exactly as planned, Apollo 4 lifted off at 1 second after 7 o'clock, November 9th, 1967, with its first stage delivering 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The command module, which would contain the flight crew in a manned mission, was separated, then oriented with its heat shield forward. At about 8 hours, 40 minutes after liftoff, Apollo 4 re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. Temperatures on the heat shield, which was less than 3 inches thick, soon reached 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was 1,000 degrees hotter than the launch pad flame bucket when Apollo 4 lifted off. Yet the temperature inside the command module never exceeded 70 degrees. Could we have seen the actual command module on its path toward Earth, it would have resembled a meteorite from space. The command module splashed into the Pacific Ocean within sight of its recovery ship, the USS Bennington. Although charred, the 5.5-ton command module, like the entire 3,000-ton Apollo Saturn V, had passed the test. Further, the chain of ground facilities and the launch and flight teams had shown themselves equal to the task.
But we're still testing the next rocket, so that someday we can go to the moon and make our world a great deal bigger. She held her hands up to her face. Wouldn't Shakespeare have admired that happy ending? She whispered. Then she put the book away in her lower desk drawer. It was quiet and still in the room. You could hear the soft rain on the windows. Thank you for the cream puffs, I said. The quality of mercy is not strained, she said. Mrs. Baker looked up and almost smiled, a real smile, again. And that was when Mrs. Biggio came into the classroom. Actually, she didn't quite come in. She opened the door and stood leaning against the doorway, one hand up to her mouth and the other trembling on the doorknob. Mrs. Baker stood. Oh, Edna, did they find him? Mrs. Biggio nodded. And is he? Mrs. Biggio opened her mouth, but the only sounds that came out were the sounds of sadness. I can't tell you what they sounded like, but you know them when you hear them. Mrs. Baker sprinted out from behind her desk and gathered Mrs. Biggio in her arms. She held Mrs. Biggio to her own chair, where Mrs. Baker sprinted out from behind her desk and gathered Mrs. Biggio in her arms. She helped Mrs. Biggio to her own chair, where she slumped down like someone who had nothing left in her. Mr. Hoodhood, you may go home now, Mrs. Baker said. I did, but I will never forget those sounds. What happened? We're going to find out, but I know your mind's churning right now. Did they find him? Who's him? And what does Mrs. Biggio, why would she be so upset? I found out the next day that Mrs. Biggio's husband had died on a small hill with no name in a small part of Vietnam. He had died at night on a reconnaissance mission. Afterward, the Army decided the hill was not a significant military target and abandoned it. Mrs. Biggio's husband died, and then they didn't even keep worrying about that hill. 3 weeks later, the body of First Sergeant Anthony Biggio of the United States Marine Corps was brought back home and buried in the cemetery beside St. Adalbert's, the church he had been christened and married in. The Hometown Chronicle showed a picture of Mrs. Biggio on the front page, holding in one hand the American flag that had draped over his casket, now folded into a triangle. The other hand was over her face. 2 nights after that, the Hometown Chronicle showed a different picture, the home of the Catholic Relief Agency where my tea lived, which had been attacked by unknown vandals. Across its front was scrawled these words in broad black letters: "Go home, Vietcong." So here I'm just going to talk to you really quickly about the Vietcong. I'm actually not going to talk about them. I'm going to let you see this video. So the Viet Cong were militia trained by North Vietnam, and they were sent into South Vietnam and were sort of embedded into South Vietnam. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to help out the northern Vietnamese, the communists, the side that was against the United States. They were trying to help out the North Vietnamese defeat both South Vietnam and the United States that were coming to help South Vietnam. Now, my tea wasn't part of the Viet Cong, but people here in the United States, it was hard to tell the difference. It was hard to tell the difference in Vietnam, who was who, especially since most of these Viet Cong were embedded right into many of the villages in South Vietnam. So American soldiers would be trying to liberate these southern Vietnamese villages, and they would run into people who they thought were from South Vietnam, and it turned out they would be Viet Cong. They used guerrilla warfare, so they didn't fight like soldiers fought in regular wars. They hid in bunkers, they hid in different tunnels, they hid in trees, and of course this was their homeland, so they knew the area much better than the American soldiers who were from all over the United States. They were visiting a place from thousands of miles away to fight in this battle. So the Viet Cong were a very effective group of soldiers used by the North Vietnamese, the communists, the side against the United States, and they were hidden in South Vietnam, and they were very effective. So you can see that the Vietnam War was very complicated, and my tea living in America is very complicated, and it was a scary time in 1967 and 1968. We know what it's like to be living in a scary time. Like, we're missing like the last 3 months of school. We understand like how it feels to just not be sure about how things are going, and imagine being a country at war and you're not really sure what the war means, and you have a person like my tea who's coming from Vietnam, and it's you're a kid. It's confusing, and it's okay. And Mr. Pete's message to you is, it's okay to feel confused. Just know that usually smarter adults prevail, and you can see that we're figuring out ways as we go forward, just like in 1967 and 1968, we figured out ways. And the Vietnam War went a lot longer than 1967 and 1968. We'll talk more about that, though, later on. At the happy ending of the Tempest, Prospero brings the king back together with the son, and finds Miranda's true love, and punishes the bad duke, and frees Ariel, and becomes a duke himself again. Everyone, except for Caliban, is happy, and everyone is forgiven, and everyone is fine, and they all sail away on calm seas. Happy endings. That's how it is in Shakespeare. But Shakespeare was wrong. Sometimes there isn't a Prospero to make everything fine again. And sometimes the quality of mercy is strained. So it's very interesting there. Holling and Mrs. Baker sort of reach this big moment, and then just as that happens, Mrs. Biggio flips the coin, and her life is completely uprooted. Okay, we are going to work on our crop QVS. You're going to watch me do one, and then you're going to get to do one to turn in. We're just trying it today, okay? Do the best you can. And you can choose to use the sheet, or you can choose to do the notebook version. It's up to you, okay? All right, on to December, my favorite month. It's not my favorite month. There's a bunch that are really up there. Those kids that have read this, though, they know that there's lots of really good chapters coming. So here we go, December.